Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our last PD opportunity, or rather our last expert session. We have one still this afternoon, and this is on the papers category. My personal favorite, I will say. So my name is Elyssa Tardif. I am the co-coordinator of the Massachusetts program and also the director of education at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'll be serving as the moderator for our conversation today. And first, I just want all of our other coordinators, if they could introduce themselves. And Kate, I'll pass it to you.
Hi, I'm Kate Melchior. I'm the other co-coordinator for the Massachusetts History Day program. I also work at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm the Assistant Director of Education. And I'll pass it over to Samantha.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Hunter. I'm the Education Outreach Manager at the Rhode Island Historical Society, and I'm also the coordinator of Rhode Island History Day. Rebecca, I'll pass it on to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Tabor Conover. I'm head of History Day in Connecticut and public programs here at the Connecticut Democracy Center, which is located at Connecticut's Old State House in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm really excited for our paper session today, and I'm going to turn it over next to my colleague, John.
Good morning. My name is John Taylor. I'm the museum assistant at the Margaret Chase Smith Library. I'm also the coordinator for National History Day in Maine.
Thanks again to all my colleagues for helping make this series possible this summer. So we have some very esteemed panelists joining us today for our conversation. Very excited to have them. I'm going to provide just very brief intros to them. We have two right now, and hopefully, I think our third panelist is having some tech issues. Hopefully he'll be able to join us in a little bit. But we have this morning Dr. Sara Georgini. Dr. Georgini earned her PhD in history from Boston University in 2016. She is the series editor for the Papers of John Adams, part of the Adams Papers project at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and author of the wonderful Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Adams Family, published in 2018. She is co-founder and contributor to the blogs The Junto and the Society for U.S. Intellectual History, and writes on American history, thought, and culture for Smithsonian and for CNN. We also have with us Dr. Donald Rogers. Dr. Rogers earned a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has taught history as an adjunct instructor at the University of Connecticut campuses, Central Connecticut State University, and other Connecticut colleges and universities since 1992. Previously, he was assistant professor of history and legal studies at the University of Hartford. He is the author of Making Capitalism Safe and numerous other publications. And let's see, I will wait until Dr. Richards is able to join us, and then I'll just do a quick intro for him when he's able to.
So before we get started, should I just go over Zoom routines once more?
Please. Thank you, Kate. Yes.
So I think most of you are probably familiar with the routine at this point. But when you're in a webinar format, it's slightly different from the normal Zoom call format. And we have two ways for you to communicate with us if you're part of our teacher audience. The first way, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see two speech bubbles labeled Q&A. At any point during the program, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to drop them into that box and we will make sure that they get answered. And then you'll also see there's another speech bubble that's labeled chat, and you're able to use the chat to chat with each other, to communicate and kind of add your own thoughts and ideas in during the program. If you put any questions into the chat, we will also grab them and raise them for our panelists during the Q&A session.
Great, thank you, Kate. And so just to let you all know, our plan is to have a conversation, a roundtable conversation for about 45 minutes or so. The first part, we're going to be talking to our panelists about their experience with historical writing, with research, with editing, and then we'll move toward talking more specifically about NHD papers. They've both judged History Day, and they'll talk about that in a minute, some strategies from the best kind of judge that you could have for your papers. So I think this will be really useful for you as teachers and for your students as well. So if I could just ask, I know I promised not to call on you specifically, but I will for just this question. Dr. Georgini, if you could just talk to us about your experience with NHD.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to Elyssa and Kate and Don and John and Samantha and Rebecca and Richard and everyone who's joining us this morning, because these kinds of roundtables are such a great opportunity for those of us who work in historical societies to kind of connect to students and teachers. So thank you for that. I want to tell you some confessions of a National History Day judge today, and I'm sure my colleagues have some good ideas on that point too. I have judged at the local, state, and national levels for the last 5 or 6 years. I've also been involved in special prizes judging at all of those levels as well. So I'm happy to speak generally or specifically about how to prepare a paper for that kind of audience. And what I find as a historian, someone who started out as a kid writing history papers on a typewriter and hating the process of cranking down to put in footnotes and cranking back up to write the text, which surely dates me, what I learned is that it's so important to make a compelling narrative from evidence-based arguments. And I find that scholars of all ages really need to remember that. So NHD is kind of my touchstone. Once a year, I'm judging, I'm talking to scholars going through this at the first time, maybe no longer on typewriters, maybe on something a little fancier. And it reminds me that the process of writing history is difficult. It's exhausting, but it's so exhilarating. It's such a rush. So for me, NHD has that kind of sentimental connection to encouraging younger scholars, but also introducing them to the nuts and bolts of how to write history.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Rogers, could you talk to us about your experience with History Day?
So I've been involved with History Day for about 20 years. I've judged exhibits, I've judged documentaries, but I found my niche judging senior papers. What I find great about senior papers is that students still think that it's a valuable way to go. One time I asked students the question, you know, are papers out of date given the new technology? And they all insisted they're not. Because in a senior paper, you can assemble information and put forth complex arguments in ways you can't do in the other forums. So I agree that putting together a paper is a lot of work. It's a lot of rummaging for sources, synthesizing primary sources, and then crafting a very good argument in a limited amount of space. And I've always enjoyed judging those kinds of presentations.
So that's a fantastic segue, thank you, Dr. Rogers, because the first question that I had for you both was this issue of crafting an argument, and hoping that you can talk to us about how you conduct the research process, especially if a topic is maybe a little bit new to you, as it is, of course, for many of our students. If you could talk about kind of how you maintain your own voice when you are evaluating and reading other sources, and just talk a little bit about that process of crafting an argument that is original, that is kind of your own.
So I think that this is something historians at all stages struggle with. And the first thing that I remind students is never go into the archive with an argument. It's going to kind of reveal itself to you. You're going to let the sources guide you. You're going to find some evidence that conflicts with your original thoughts on the topic and what you've read and what you've seen. You're going to find some evidence that supports it, and you're going to think about how to put this all together. You kind of have to go with the flow when it comes with the sources. And I think that the second thing to really think about is that most scholars, even your super advanced historians who are working at, a graduate level or beyond, don't have these sudden jolts of revelation at a reading room desk. It's a slow process. We piece together information, citation by citation. We double check it, we triple check it. And to the third point, when you're developing an original argument, you really want to go back and read your sources more than once. This was something that I learned in graduate school, and it absolutely surprised me when a professor walked into the class and said, I was just rereading the Declaration, and I thought, well, what? Professors reread stuff? And this was a great thing to remember, that historians revisit the same sources again and again, because we're trying to do that kind of secret sauce of history. And to me, the secret sauce of history writing and developing an argument is interpretation. That's what you bring to the table, how you interpret those sources. So I think walking through your archive, thinking about where the evidence agrees or doesn't with the ideas you're developing is important. And then kind of being open to where it can take you. I got into history for the adventure of it. So I never quite know where a project is going. And I think acknowledging that and being as open as you can to what the sources tell you is important.
So I too find that historical research and writing is an organic process. I think one of the keys to good research is to start out with a pretty clear research question. What do you want to find out in your sources? And that question is going to change because as you go into the sources, you find out there are sources that exist which you didn't expect. You find some sources do not have anything to tell you. That you might thought would have helped you. But most importantly, the sources help you to reformulate your question. And as I go on in the research process, I begin forming a hypothesis. What is my argument going to be? And I'm constantly rethinking it. And I agree that you go back to the sources and you reread them, and you realize that a source that you originally looked at you thought wasn't relevant, well, it is relevant. And you go back and look at it again. So again, I use the word rummaging when I talk about, with my students about researching. I mean, a lot of the process is rummaging for the right sources that can help you to answer your research question. And then as you move on, I think it's important also to pay attention to secondary historical sources on your area. What historians have already said about your topic. And I encourage History Day teachers not to discourage students from reading books. When I read History Day papers, I see a lot of websites, which can be valuable. But the library, even in this time of COVID-19, we can get books that the library can provide the historical context to help you interpret and understand the documents, And then the last part, sort of keeping your focus on writing a paper, is given that you have research question, that question you're trying to answer, then the writing is a matter of putting together an argument, assembling and synthesizing the evidence that answers that question. And the last thing, I think, one advice that goes to all writers, the last thing that you write is your introduction with your thesis statement. And that is because you're working through the material, and it's only at the end, after you've worked through the material, do you know what your argument is going to be. So I write my introduction last, and that makes the paper a little bit clearer.
John, you're in good company because I do the same thing. I often find that I start to write the conclusion and I think, oh no, that was actually the introduction, and copy and paste, move it goes. But I was also thinking about, if I could just pick up on this for a moment, the importance of what you said about historiography in an NHD paper. And while it may sound kind of clunky and boring and also like a mountain of reading, right? Everyone who's written about the American Revolution, how will you possibly cover that in 3 months? The way I like to think about it is you're walking into a room, what conversations are you joining? So are you joining a conversation about the American Revolution and gender roles? Are you thinking about how the environmental landscape was transformed by war? Are you thinking about the relationship between patriots and loyalists on the ground in small towns? These are all conversations you can pick and choose like you're at a party. And so thinking about what conversations you're joining, the dialogue you're engaging in, that's historiography, plain and simple. And then the second thing I just wanted to pick up on, as you were talking, and I was thinking back to the part of Elyssa's question we haven't touched on, which is like the original part of the argument, because I think students get hung up on this a lot. They have to kind of reinvent the wheel, say something totally new. And the fact is you are joining a longer dialogue, but you are thinking creatively about a question that the late, great early American social historian Bernard Bailyn always asked his seminar class, which is, you know, you have your research topic, you have what you think you're going to study. So what? So what that this happened? So Professor Bailyn was really famous for asking the so what question. And sometimes I ask students who are paper writers in their interview, so what? So what did you learn? And sometimes we get to the conclusion at the interview stage, which leads to kind of, I think, our next conversation probably about organizing research, right? And how you kind of keep the momentum going while you're doing it. And that means just talking about your project as much as you can, in my opinion, to anyone and everyone who will listen. And Elyssa and Kate know this because they hear about my research projects at work on the fly all the time. And we hear about theirs, which is great. But I think that's something that I want to touch on here, because NHD to me is super valuable in that it teaches students a life skill they will use no matter what they do, which is how to research. Graduate school, not many people will actually sit you down and tell you how to research. NHD, they will. So I find this to be a really useful kind of bridging skill for a number of professional careers.
So I absolutely agree that this is an invaluable skill, and I prepare to say exactly the same thing. I mean, this is a skill that will do you well whether you become a history professor or whether you become a lawyer or some other kind of professional. One thing I think that we should add about the historical research process, and that is that it is very creative. It's not a kind of routine process of finding the information and reporting it. It's about evaluating the information and looking at the information within a historical context that we today may not totally understand. So in that process of looking at primary sources, with your research question, with some background in the secondary readings, there's a lot of discovery. Oh, I didn't know that. What does this mean? And I think that any student working on a paper should be very open to those moments of discovery, and be willing to go in directions that no one's thought about before.
I think these are great tips, and Dr. Rogers, I wanted to return to a point you made earlier about the sort of rummaging, the kind of the discovery sensibility when you go into an archive. And I think this would be for older students, but there's a wonderful article by Susan Scott Parrish. I think it's rummaging in and out of holds. So the idea of what it looks like to go into an archive, thinking you have one idea about what you're going to find, and I forget what animal it is, but she keeps saying, I think it's maybe a badger or something, that it keeps popping up in these early American records. And she makes note of it, but doesn't think anything of it. And eventually it sort of informs her whole argument. So I think to your point that if something keeps popping up, but it wasn't something that you had planned to talk about, it's still worth noting because that may be kind of the direction that your research is taking.
Right. So I think the word, it's a jargony word, but serendipity. Serendipity means that a discovery comes as a surprise, something you didn't expect, which is going to change the trajectory of your thinking and your analysis. And I think and researchers should be very open to that, be very open-minded when they go into an archive and they look at an archive. What might they find that they don't expect? And be open to change your interpretation or even change your research question.
So thinking about kind of the sort of, well, I don't know if it's the flip side of discovery, but what if you are looking at either primary sources or secondary sources and you see conflicting information? So maybe it's two scholars who quite often disagree on how they're interpreting data. How might you advise a student to deal with that when the student themselves may not know very much or may not know enough about the topic to exactly see kind of who is right?
Well, I'll answer that. I mean, one of the criteria for a History Day paper is balance. And that encourages the students to look at two sides of the question or more sides of the question. And that pertains not only to primary sources, but also the secondary sources. So my advice to students, I think to all researchers, is that you acknowledge the different points of view. You recognize the different points of view in the paper, and the paper then can sift through the evidence and decide, well, does the paper writer agree with one author or another, or maybe have a different conclusion? So I think that, in fact, the conflict is a creative possibility to rethink the topic and decide, well, what is the truth of the matter?
And I think it's a really good point that historians aren't black and white, even in their writing. So a lot of the best historians you'll ever read will hedge after they've done a lot of reading. And they'll say, as far as we know, from what we can tell, that's okay to learn to write that way. There's some kind of confidence to that. One thing that I write over and over again on NHD papers is to remember to maintain some sense of the historian's neutrality, right? Some kind of, you can't have perfect objectivity, but you should be able to present opposing views within your narrative. And this is a hard skill to learn. I think scholars who work on, say, the American Civil War would back me up on this, or just about any kind of major turning point in American history. But something where you have a moment where you have conflicting evidence is, as Don says, an opportunity for a creative, careful, nuanced narrative. And it's never too early to try doing that. NHD is a wonderful sandbox for younger scholars who are writing history. This is the time to play around with it and to see if you can make it work. The same thing goes not just for conflicting data that you might encounter, but big schools of thought. I've actually seen a lot of attempts at intellectual history happening in the last two NHDs that I've judged, where high school students are playing around with theory or how to frame something or how to write it from a very particular perspective. And I think that's really interesting and exciting. So I always look for students who are trying to make that leap and do it with some kind of professional neutrality in mind. So to me, that's a standout paper. Someone who can present conflicting evidence and say, here's what I've got, and I'm grappling with it. That is a way better answer than here's 50 sources that only back up one side.
I'd like to ask just one more question about kind of your own writing and research process, and then hopefully we can move to talking more specifically, as we're kind of touching our toe in, to talking more specifically about NHD. But just thinking, and I know this is something that students can struggle with as well, and Dr. Georgini, you just mentioned, you have 50 sources that you're looking at. How do you decide what to cut? If you have a lot, many of our students are so passionate about these topics, and there's just a lot that they want to cover. And as we know, editing can be, and culling can be kind of difficult sometimes. What are the kinds of questions that you ask yourself as you're editing? Do you have any tips on how to get rid of the thing that you think is really cool, but maybe doesn't quite fit the argument?
Well, the key in my mind, in my own writing, when I decide to cut, and there's always a limit on the length, every writer has a length limit, does the material I have presented answer the research question in the paper? And so relevance is the most important thing. If a point, even though it may be very interesting, a very interesting anecdote. If it doesn't help you support your argument in the paper, then I think it's something that can be cut. Something else is redundancies. There's a convention, you need really say, make one point once. You don't have to make it again and again, and so redundancies can be removed. And then here's a problem I have is wordiness. I mean, have you made the point in a succinct, direct, clear manner? And I have the tendency to use 10 words where one will suffice. So by going back and cutting out wordiness, and getting to the point is another area where I find that I can cut down the length of my writing and get to the point.
Since you answered the history part of that question so beautifully, I'll talk about the nuts and bolts of the writing bit here. I would say block quotes are the first to go. No one reads them. It means that you as the historian need to do some synthesis there. You have an opportunity to step in and bring that story kind of to the fore. So padding with block quotes is something I always look for in my own writing. Next on the chopping block to go are adjectives and adverbs. Make sure your verbs are powerful. Ensure it, because that is what a reader is following history for, a sequence of actions, right? So it's not just one darn thing after another. And then I think finally, you want to kind of realize as you work on a project that you're going to have basically 3 kinds of days: reading days, writing days, and thinking days. And it's going to be a mix of both. And editing is going to happen at some point, probably in all of them. They're all valuable days to have. So I think just kind of pacing yourself and thinking about, today is a day I just need to look at grammar. Today is a day I just need to style footnotes. Today is a day I need to reread that source and think if it works with my argument or not. So I think being a good reader of your work self-reflexively will make you a better writer as well.
So I want to insert a question here because it's really relevant to what we've been talking about. This is a question from a teacher. Is there a process that you go through to form your research question? We keep talking about how you want to maintain relevance by returning to that question as you do your research, but how do you actually get to that research question to begin with, even your sort of first stab at that hypothesis?
Now, I think that I reach a research question by doing 2 things. First off, by learning from general sources something about the topic to be informed about it. Students can find online encyclopedias. I would not recommend Wikipedia, but vetted online encyclopedias might be a place to start, just to get a general idea of the subject. And then secondly, to examine what historians have already said about the topic and what are some of the issues that they have raised about it. And to think about what those historians have written and what are their arguments, what sources have they not consulted, what questions haven't they answered. And from that, I'm able to go on and sort of frame a question of my own that can produce some original research, some original ideas.
So I think I follow much the same process. Something else that I think about in tandem with research questions is timeline. So historians want to understand change over time. And I think, what is the period that I'm going to be writing in? What's the kind of history I want to produce? Is it an intellectual, a cultural, a social history? Why do I need certain disciplinary tools to write in that genre? And what kind of sources am I going to hunt for based on that? So I think kind of sketching out your research questions is a good practice, knowing that you're going to refine them all the way through.
I think that's great. And it occurs to me when you do plot out, you read a few encyclopedia articles maybe, and you can plot out maybe a timeline of a particular event. And then if you ask the question, why why did this group do this? Why did this person choose this? I think that's where you can start to get the very kind of basic questions, because you don't know enough about the topic yet. But that's typically what I do. I always wonder about intentionality, why people chose to make the decisions that they did, because of course none of this was inevitable. You know, history happens because people make a series of choices, right?
I think here we can make a pitch for the History Day theme. And the History Day theme will help you greatly to formulate your question. This year it's communication, mode to understanding. And I think, I mean, what does that exactly does that mean? And I mean, so going into a research topic with that framework in mind, I think can help students formulate a question.
And can I just add to that we can also make a great pitch here for the diversity of choices of scholarship you can do at NHD. Obviously, I am fully on board with papers, but you also can think, would this be a good documentary? Would this work as a website? And that's something that's so critical, because as a working historian, you will probably at some point in your career do all of those things. So thinking about what form your scholarship is going to take is super important. And I love that NHD gives so many choices for it.
Absolutely. So let's dig in a little more to NHD and the sort of specific papers that you all have seen for many years. So one characteristic of a great student paper that we've already mentioned is the ability to handle conflicting sources. You know, how can the student serve as historian and present the sort of merits of different arguments? What are some other characteristics that you have seen that you would say make a superior NHD paper?
I think there's an opportunity for students to combine personal interest with professional growth. So, for example, I can think of many papers on, say, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and I can think of the ones that stood out and why. I remember seeing an incredible monologue about it in the performances, and I remember reading an incredible paper about it that was written by a student who said, when I asked, well, why'd you pick this topic? She said, well, everyone in my family has always worked in a factory for the last 3 generations, and my mom had never heard of this fire. And so it became kind of a personal quest for her to understand. So I'm always interested in someone who really brings all of themselves to the research table, because that's what we do as scholars. And so learning that whatever background you come from, or the education you have access to, or the family history and lore you've heard, or what you've seen on TV, that can kind of motivate you to attempt some history, because history is very much a human project for all of us to try. So I think I'm really interested in papers like that. In terms of the nitty-gritty papers that I think really have that finishing touch, I can tell when a student has done one final copy edit and when they haven't. So looking over your citations, making sure they're not brainy quotes, but actual primary and secondary sources, things like that are just a little bit more professional. That's what we're looking for.
So I think there are many qualities to a superior History Day paper. I think one is good engagement with the History Day theme. I've read many good papers that verge off and they don't develop the History Day theme. And so I stick. Last year was breaking barriers. This year is communication. So I think what the student that stays on track is good. The second thing is, as a superior paper, we'll consult a wide range of sources. That the material, either in secondary sources or primary sources, is not narrow. It's not unilateral, but it's many different sources that help the student to develop a pretty sophisticated narrative on the topic. And the final thing, and I will agree with my colleague, is that craftsmanship is really important. A superior paper is one that has the proper word length, that eliminates typos, and the footnotes and bibliography are in good order. So footnotes and bibliography don't are not, counted in the word count. But if you have two very good papers sitting in front of you, and one doesn't format footnotes properly, and doesn't have proper, annotations of bibliography, that's going to make the other paper stand out. So craftsmanship, I think, is very important. And I agree, it's part of the writing process, is that students and myself, you have to budget time so that when you finish a piece of writing, that there is time for you to put it down and then come back to it and read it and edit it very, very carefully to eliminate any, small errors that may have slipped in. And we never get them all out, but we try. And so I think the craftsmanship, that care that goes into polishing the paper at the end, is something that makes a superior paper stand out.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I love about NHD, and what I see in students is that it does offer that time to improve, right? I mean, there's so few other projects that you work on for almost an entire year, and from one contest to the next, you're offered that opportunity to kind of respond to feedback and make it better and better. So it's great that we even, can allow students the time to do that. So kind of along those lines, I'm thinking about how History Day is different from other papers that students might be writing in class. One of the, of course, the theme is what sort of makes it stand out, but are there other characteristics that make the NHD paper different from what students, if they've never done it before, will encounter when they engage with the program?
I think in terms of NHD topics, students often adventure outside the textbook to find their topics. So this calls for an extra level of help sometimes when it comes to navigating JSTOR with a local librarian, or using the university library for the first time with their parents. There's some different kinds of resources and networks that students learn to tap into, and they learn how long it actually takes to do research, which I think is an important kind of thing to learn. You may think, aha, today is journal article reading day, and that will only take me 8 hours, but it takes you 2 days instead. So you really learn how you're working as a historian. And again, I think that speaks to the strong emphasis on professionalizing that NHD has, which is one of my favorite things about it. But you really learn how you work here as a historian.
So again, I agree with Dr. Georgini. I think one thing that makes the History Day paper stand out in all History Day projects is that they're very open-ended. I mean, students find a topic and they go research it on their own. I mean, much as a professional historian would do. This means students have to make a lot of mature, intelligent decisions about how they're going to proceed. The second difference is the immersion in primary sources. I mean, this is the bread and butter of historical research. So students, again, have to rummage through primary sources. They have to evaluate them. They have to interpret them and then present them in a way that's interesting and informative to readers. And finally, I agree that this history paper is something, it's a long project. It's not like as I recollect, a term paper or a book report that you can knock out in an afternoon. The history paper is much more sophisticated, and it takes some planning over time to formulate a topic, rummage for sources and develop them, and then to synthesize them into a paper. And the writing goes slowly. I was going to quote at one point a statement by the great inventor Thomas Edison. You all know the quotation. Genius, he said, is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And for me, this is what historical writing is about. It takes a lot of work to slowly and carefully craft it. And I couldn't do a History Day paper in one sitting. It's something you have to do over time and put it together and rethink, and then at the end, you can then refine it. So planning, and to spend some time putting the final paper together is something that makes it different. It's a much more sophisticated work, and really is sort of one step. It's a bridge between high school work and professional work. That's what I think a History Day paper is.
I know, we've talked about, Dr. Georgini, that paper that you read on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and that connection to the students' kind of personal life. Are there other papers that either of you have seen that have really stuck with you, and why did they?
Well, I'll jump in again because I have a lot of papers that I've loved over the years, and I think very fondly of. I know students who've made research trips to international archives and to track down descendants of abolitionists and the enslaved, which has always been a powerful thing to hear about. I can remember papers where students did a little research and then went back to visit a local historic site that they'd always passed by and they thought they knew, and wow, that monument had changed overnight thanks to their reading. And then I think the other component that we didn't have this year because we were in a virtual realm, but which I really love, is the interviews when we get to talk to students, because often I find that students who opt for the papers option are not the biggest fans of public speaking, and that's why they chose it. So they're kind of desperate to communicate their findings, and they have earned some confidence through their work, but this is their first chance to really talk about it with us. And often, it's hard to keep to time because we go over our 10 minutes. They're so excited with all of their finds. The two that stand out to me, one was a paper that we judged at College Park at the Nationals, and it was about the passage of the American Disabilities Act, a topic that's very popular every year, dealing with the ADA. And when the student came in, she entered in her wheelchair and began by telling us how many ramps it took her to get to the judging room and how they wouldn't have existed. And I thought that was such a powerful personal connection to her source. Another student told me that she loathed public speaking, and when I asked how she felt different or how the project changed her for other work, she was super quiet for a moment, and then she just said, and I want to quote her exactly, "I got more brave." And I thought, wow.
That's amazing. Well, and I just want to jump in and say we've just been joined by our third panelist, Dr. David Richards. Dr. Richards, are you there?
I am here.
I just wondered, would you mind talking to the question we have now, which is, are there particular student projects that you have seen over the years that really stuck with you, and why might they have been so powerful?
Well, I actually have two, and I was going to show them as a show and tell. The first one is a young woman from Pennsylvania who wrote about Margaret Chase Smith. So she had gotten in touch with the library to get resources. And she went on to become a national winner at the junior individual performance level. And we invited her to come to the library and give her presentation. And she gave us her process paper, which is 30 pages long. And as I looked through her annotated bibliography, it was graduate school level. And this is from someone who was in junior high school. And that was back in 1990. She competed in 1996, and we had her speak at the library in 1997. And then more recently, I think this was in 2018, I had a student who wrote about U.S. intervention in Korea back in the 19th century. It was very timely because it was a time when we were having the issues with North Korea. And so it was very informative to see how what we were contending with today had antecedents all the way back in the 19th century. But what impressed me was he was a young man who was Korean American, so he spoke Korean, so he was able to read primary sources in Korea, and he actually had gone to Korea and done archival research. So that very much impressed me.
Well, I'm always just blown away when students, and maybe they speak the language already, or even if they don't, just making that extra effort to sort of go beyond even, Google Translate to get that. That's really special. And just to say too, for our attendees, so Dr. David Richards, who's just speaking, just joined us. I'll give you just a brief bio, if that's okay, just so folks know who you are. So Dr. Richards joined the Margaret Chase Smith Library staff as assistant director in 1996 and became director in 2012. Previously, he was executive secretary of the Androscoggin Historical Society in Auburn, Maine, and curator of collections at the United Society of Shakers in New Gloucester, Maine. Dr. Richards earned his PhD in history from the University of New Hampshire and is the author of Poland Spring, A Tale of the Gilded Age. So another among our esteemed experts in both writing and in HD. And I want to give Dr. Rogers a chance to answer that. Do you have any other papers that really come to mind for you?
Again, I agree with my colleagues on this. I have very good papers every year. I'm thinking about an outstanding paper last year, which won an award at the national level. This was a paper about birth control in India, the sterilization to cut down the birth rate in India, post-World War II India. So three things that really stood out about that paper. One is that it was very, very well researched. The student went into the Rockefeller archives to examine the involvement of the United States and Americans in this program in India. Very well researched. But the thing that stood out most is that the student understood the complexity of the topic. The topic last year was breaking barriers. And so the barrier that was being broken was the barrier of population overgrowth in India. But what the paper goes on to show is that breaking barriers, for some people sometimes means reimposing them or tightening the barriers on other people, because this turned out to be a very heavy-handed program for forced sterilization in India. So that made it stand out. And the last thing that made it stand out was just very, very good craftsmanship. Very, very good craftsmanship.
And so you all may have seen in the chat that the student that Dr. Rogers was just mentioning will actually be joining us at 1 p.m. So you'll be able to ask them questions about their apparently superior paper. So that's good to know. So I want to, at this point, open it up if there are questions. I have many more questions, but I want to turn it over to our teachers and our coordinators. If any of you have questions for our panelists. And it looks like we may have one already. What suggestions do you have to help students organize their resources so they can find them to reread? Great question.
Well, this goes into note-taking techniques. So, I'm old-fashioned, and so I still take my notes on paper. Students may not do that anymore, but somehow. I think there has to be some kind of sorting mechanism whereby students take notes and then sort them in a place where they can find them by topic. So good note taking I think is very, very important in the process. The second thing is when the students prepare to write their papers is to develop a pretty good outline. Again, it's flexible because when you begin writing, you begin changing your thinking and reorganizing. But an outline, I think, is essential. So good note-taking and outline, I think, will help students put their papers together.
I would second the old school approach. When I was writing my dissertation / first book, which is a 300-year history of American religion in one family, I actually wrote out my major chapter themes and sources on index cards, because index cards don't crash like computers. So I knew I had a backup. And also because it's very therapeutic sometimes to just kind of throw them on the floor and organize them around the way that you want the chapter themes to flow and your sources to go. So it's kind of a good visual process. And then the second thing I'd say, absolutely yes to an outline. But I'd also add that I am a fan of writing footnotes as you go. I do not go back and do them later because I will never remember which box and which letter on which day I am citing to. And it's terrible to go back and see, like, past Sara Georgini left a note to future Sara Georgini to double check this footnote. No one needs to see that. So thinking about how you can kind of work in your footnotes as you go will also give you a sense of, is this evidence shaping up to make the argument I want it to make? Is my narrative in line with what I found? So organizing your research is not something, and I think this is important for students to know, it's not something that happens once. You don't say, okay, I've done all the reading, I'm gonna sit down, today's the day to organize research, tomorrow I write. You're going to move around that research and reorganize it as you write, as you reread, as you revisit sources. So know that it's kind of an organic but integrated process in that way.
I'm old school as well, index cards and outlines.
I have to say, it's since so much about, or spending so much time on Zoom and everything lately, I do find that the notepad is just a really lovely invention to have. But I will say, just my own work, I like to work in Google Drive, and I find that keeping things in an Excel sheet, it doesn't seem like, I feel like Excel I use for, it doesn't occur to me that that would be good for creative writing or historical writing, but I do find that that can help to organize the data, especially when there are lots of footnotes that I'm keeping note of, things like that. Other questions? And as Kate mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to put them either in the chat or you can put them in our Q&A box as well. And if any of the coordinators have any questions too, please feel free. Looks like, here's a question. What advice would you give to a group of students who are working together in writing the paper as opposed to working alone?
Elyssa, can I just jump in on this quickly?
Yes, yeah.
So just to clarify for everybody, the paper category is the only one where students have to work individually. They can't work in groups. But perhaps, you know, in thinking about writing process papers for some of the other categories, this advice about group writing could be really helpful.
That's great. I thought maybe something had changed. I was a little nervous.
I was wondering about that, and I thought, you know, this is great because the Adams Papers is a collaborative of editors, and I thought, a mini Adams Papers is born. Maybe not yet, but I would think that a writing group can be really helpful. So maybe if there's a bunch of students who are all working on individual papers, like a place to bounce ideas off your friends works great.
Yeah, and actually, I just have to say from personal experience, I have had a group try to register that they did a paper together, and we had to explain that we can't allow that. And just also a clarification that if you have a whole class doing the same the same research, it's not something that can just be shared amongst them to each their paper. They really have to have maybe it's a general, okay, they're all going to look at the American Revolution, but they have to be looking at different aspects of it, just so that there's no confusion out there.
And I don't think we mentioned this already, but I mean, the other project categories do have to write process papers, and there are groups that write those. So, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on, I know yesterday we were talking about in the performance category, having just a live document like in Google Drive, a Google Doc that students can talk about and then write together in real time so that they kind of understand the changes that they're making. I don't know if any of you all can speak to kind of working with another writer, working with another editor. How do you kind of manage that relationship, that dynamic?
That's what makes editors so vitally important, is to make sure there's a consistency of style. I have worked on a couple of projects that were co-authored. We each independently did our own chapters, but in every case there was an editor who was making sure that we had similar styles.
Mm-hmm.
So someone ultimately has to be an arbiter.
Yeah, I think learning how to do that kind of humanities teamwork at the student level this early is so fruitful for opportunities later on outside the university if you want to work as a historian. Certainly public historians, curators, library professionals, documentary editors, we all kind of work in collaborative teams. So this is another really great kind of opportunity to bounce ideas off of each other. I think the thing that we bring to the table, not just the consistency of style point is great, and I was about to make it, so thank you. But I think everyone brings a different methodology in our own editorial project. We all have a slightly different scholarly focus. We might be a little more finely attuned to one part of the field in the historiography than the person sitting next to us. And that's kind of great to be involved in a common cause, but to each have an individual voice that we can blend in to give the primary sources extra context is important.
So I think that sort of group work comes in at two levels. On the first level is allocation of work. So if you have a documentary or you have an exhibit, the students might divide the work up so that individual students work on particular parts of it. The other level is stepping back and students looking at the project as a whole, so that they would see, hey, does the exhibit, the documentary, the paper, does it all hang together? Or do you see, inconsistencies between the different parts? So there's a kind of individual assignment that goes into this, and then also a kind of collective evaluation of the final product where all the good ideas can come together.
I think there's a really interesting opportunity here for educators to think about collaborative projects that might support and supplement NHD work in the classroom. A friend of mine who does NHD with her American History high school class also has them as a group write a novel. It has to be set in the 19th century, and it has to feature a certain kind of rotating cast of characters whom they may have discussed throughout the year. And at least one of them is P.T. Barnum, so it's bound not to be boring. So it teaches students to kind of work as a group and to do solo work, because that's what you're going to do for the rest of your career as a historian.
I have a question. Because I actually judge a lot of papers. I judge papers at the national contest every year. And one thing I do notice is that students like to use the appendices quite a bit and add in a lot more information through that and try to, go past the word limit that is possible by using the appendix. So what are your thoughts on the best possible strategies on using the appendices, and is it needed? Like adding photos, if you're talking about, a piece of artwork or something like that, obviously you'd want to put that in. But what are your thoughts on using the appendices?
I think this is a judgment call for the particular paper. I mean, if the appendices are useful to document a point made in the paper with a photograph and a caption, or a table that presents some statistical information, I think that would be valuable. But I think a judge might be careful to examine whether the appendix becomes, as you suggested, a way to add in more words. And in that case, then the judge might decide, well, that's not permissible. So something that's truly a supplement is good, but something it's a way, sort of a way to get around the word limit, then the judge might step in.
So any final questions? These have been some really great resources so far, good strategies.
So I have one suggestion. This is a small pet peeve, but I just sort of send out advice. This is in footnote format. As a History Day paper judge, I often find that footnotes have some recurring errors, and the biggest one is putting last name first, and that in footnotes first name goes first always, and bibliography last name goes first. So I'm not quite sure why this error is happening, but it's a little tiny mistake that we see in more than half the History Day papers. So in footnotes, first name goes first.
I'd invite students to think critically about sources they find online. So considering where something is posted, if it's a primary or secondary source, where it actually traces back to, that's something to think about. There is just a plethora of digital resources that are available for students to use, far more than when I was a kid back on that typewriter, which is great. But it also means that we need to think with some critical rigor about how we're marshaling that material and presenting it. So I'd encourage students, and I always say this, to interrogate the archive. So really ask some questions of your documents. Where are they from? Why are they there? Who left them? And in thinking about that cornucopia of resources that you can access digitally, or hopefully when our libraries and archives reopen in full in person, then I'd also recommend that you think about how it fits with your argument and whether it contradicts it. And then finally, this is a super important thing I always remind students of, where the archive falls silent. What's the thing you thought you'd find that you didn't find? Because dollars to donuts, that is your next research question and your next research project. So my final question to students often in an interview when they've written a paper is, what do you want to follow up on? If this project had a sequel, what would it be? And I get such great answers, because that's when I see they've really understood that framing a question is the way to approach history, more than just repeating some answers.
That's wonderful. Dr. Richards, I wanted to give you an opportunity, if you wanted to speak to kind of what our panelists have just been saying, kind of, characteristics of what you really like to see in the paper, or even kind of common missteps that you, that may be pet peeves or things that you just would want to caution students to avoid, if you had anything you wanted to speak to.
The characteristics that I most look for are good organization and connection to the theme of History Day, and then sources used, the variety of sources, and an understanding of the distinction between primary and secondary sources, which sometimes gets confused. And so the missteps are sort of the inverse of that. One's papers that aren't well organized, papers that forget to connect to the theme, or connect to the theme in the introduction and then forget to reconnect with the theme in the conclusion, and then ones that don't have an abundance of sources and don't have an understanding of what primary versus secondary sources are. And in terms of, even within that, then there is an element, even if it's well organized, you're hoping to find good writing. And I think people have mentioned earlier that writing isn't just sitting down and putting a first draft together. To me, writing is really rewriting. So hopefully there'll be many versions of what the final paper is, so that they can polish up what their first thoughts are.
That's great. And you raised an especially important point, I think, the distinction between primary and secondary sources that we haven't yet talked about today. So that's a great one to underscore. I know, Rebecca, did you want to mention the new rule about word count in papers, just to let our teachers know?
Yeah, the new rules, I actually just pulled up the rules. It says the captions in words and footnotes and endnotes other than the citation now count towards the paper word limit. Right. In addition to the student composed words in the quoted material. And then there is also now that a process paper is now required for papers. starting in 2021. Before that was not part of the deal. So
I think it's a great change, personally. I love to see that.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, I think we've reached our time. Such just wonderful, wonderful perspectives and great strategies, I think, for students that we've heard this morning. So I'm going to invite you all to come back at 1 p.m. To hear more from the student with that wonderful paper that we heard from Dr. Rogers earlier today. And just a huge thank you, a lot of gratitude for our panelists this morning for spending time with us and offering their expertise and continuing to support History Day, because I know they're stalwart judges, and I don't think a virtual contest is going to scare them away. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.